Great. We can go ahead and get started. My name's Amanda Pasek. I am Associate Director for Digital Marketing for Selby Gardens. And today we have a great presentation for you. This is the final installment of our three-part series on delicious history, a culinary exploration of our region. We will have opportunities for questions once in the middle of the presentation and once at the end. So please put those in the chat feature down below. And without further ado, here is John McCarthy.
All right, thanks, Amanda, and welcome everyone. And thanks for joining us today. And I hope perhaps you've had an opportunity to enjoy some of the other programs this summer leading up to this grand finale. And in particular, I'd like to thank Jennifer Romanicki, our president and CEO of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, for supporting these programs that we're offering all the time for our guests and our members. And it's been my pleasure to put these programs together this summer, a little bit out of my comfort zone. I am not a chef, I'm not a cook, but I've really enjoyed researching these old recipes and getting a better understanding for what the early people in this area faced with such a fundamental need as food. And so today we're going to continue as we have earlier this summer. I want to thank some of the volunteers that help me out all the time in gathering information for these programs. And this series in particular, we've all been having our eyes out for interesting recipes and stories that can go along with them. So I certainly appreciate the work. These are just some of the many, many volunteers that, of course, contribute so much to both campuses of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. We could not do what we do without them. So this whole summer series was inspired by Fran Newton, a longtime volunteer at the historic Spanish Point campus. Fran was a world traveler and she loved food, everything about it. And she began doing cooking classes at Spanish Point years and years ago, and then ultimately helped a team of people create a cookbook called Cooking Then and Now, which in 1994 won the Tabasco National Award for community cookbooks. And so that's one of the sources for the recipes that I'll be sharing today. These are some old items from our newsletters. Actually shows Fran in this photograph in the lower right-hand corner. She's standing on the right-hand side. And the way she would do these luncheons is that people would sign up for them, and then she would actually have them helping to prepare their own lunch. And this was quite a popular thing. They did all different types of recipes. You see a couple of them here. Here's a class for citrus and loquats, what to do with them. And then a cooking class called Florida Picnic, very appropriate. And so anyway, it was Fran's spirit of combining history with food was what inspired me to do this series. And Fran, as well as many other people, are just captivated by the thought that most of the historic Spanish Point campus was actually built from food, from seafood, right? So as the Native Americans gathered up the seafood from the bay and consumed it, they used the shells to build a higher foundation for their homes, like you see in this image. In the case of over at the Guptill House, they built a huge circular ring around a freshwater spring. And so actually our campus is essentially built from food. And if we look at this part of the map, the areas that I've circled in yellow really completely show where the landscape was changed by the utilization of the shellfish in building up a new landscape for people to live. So food and Selby Gardens go hand in hand. This is another one of the sources, and I've used a lot of the recipes from this book in today's program. This was a cookbook that was produced by the Sarasota Women's Club in 1914, and it has recipes from many people who lived in Sarasota at the time, members of the Women's Club, but also people from the surrounding area. And this cookbook was a fundraiser so that they could raise money to purchase land and build a home for their organization, which now today we know as the little building on the corner of Palm Avenue and Coconut that is owned by Florida Studio Theater. So this cookbook helped to build that building. Today's program, we're going to talk about some Osprey favorites, some things that were eaten at historic Spanish Point years ago and in the Osprey area. Then we're going to do a few Sarasota favorites. And then we're going to do sweets and treats as we have for each of the three programs, which in this case will include both desserts and a few drinks. So I wanted to go back to some of these images that I was showing while you might have been in the waiting room. And these are all out of the 1914 Women's Club cookbook. They were advertisements that helped to fund the cookbook itself. And so you've got cornstarch and baking powder and evaporated milk and chocolate. And these were some of the ingredients that someone would need to prepare the food. And so one of the great things about Florida, and particularly coastal Florida, was in the old days, you were never going to starve. The bay was full of protein, easy to catch fish, easy to harvest shellfish. The woods were full of game. But if you were going to bake, if you were going to prepare food in any other way than just heating it up, you needed these other things to make that happen. And so as I was thinking about today's program, I wanted to share a little bit about, well, where did people get these things, over time? So I created this little Sarasota region grocery store timeline. And so basically, from the time that the Webbs arrived from New York down at what we now know as our Spanish Point campus in 1867, all the way up through 1886, basic supplies were a sailboat trip away. You had to go up to the Manatee River or further north to Cedar Key or south to Key West. Those were the places along the coast where you could get the things that you needed. And so when you think about that span of time, that meant that there was a lot of traveling going on. Now, the good news for the Webb family, for instance, at Spanish Point, was that every trip they went out to buy things, they were also going to sell things. And so as they would travel to sell their citrus and their other products, whether that was Cedar Key or Key West, it gave them an opportunity to shop for other things that they needed to kind of round out their homestead, their lifestyle, and their menu. And then things really changed in 1885, 1886, because that was when the downtown Sarasota was very deliberately developed as a real estate project. And people began to come to Sarasota as we know it today, Main Street, Lower Main Street, 5 Points, for instance. And so from 1886 till about 1899, basic supplies were available in Sarasota. In fact, the photograph on here is of Highsmith, Turner, and Prime. And they were the general merchandise store in Sarasota. This is actually a photo from 1899. And so at that point, you could get a lot more stuff because they were bringing in all these different things that they thought people needed. And in those days, it was everything from baking flour to caskets. It's whatever the community needed. They were the place where you went to get it. Hardware store, all wrapped furniture, all wrapped into one, but certainly plenty of groceries. And then things really changed after 1903 because this was when the railroad arrived in Sarasota. So from 1903 onward, you could obtain virtually anything that you wanted that was available in the country because the railroad could bring it to Sarasota. It would be many years before the railroad would make its way down to Venice, get a little closer to Osprey. But in any case, and just to mention a few of the basics, I've mentioned some of them and shown you the advertisements, but basics would have been things like flour and baking powder and cornstarch and condensed milk. Milk was very hard to keep fresh. If you owned your own cow, you could have fresh milk. But if you didn't own your own cow, very difficult to get fresh milk. So people used a lot of canned milk back in those days. And then recently we discovered in some of the documentation that John Webb actually kept a little shelf down at his winter resort. Now this would be White Cottage at Spanish Point campus. And he would sell you sugar or coffee or beans or salt bacon, things like soap. And so the visitors that came to the resort could obtain some of these things. And like take salt bacon, for instance. This is, meat that was heavily preserved. And for the sportsmen who were going out hunting and fishing, they could take some of this out there with them. They didn't have to worry about refrigeration or something going bad. And so you did have all of these things available, but over time you had to travel the greater distance to get them early on and travel the least distance. In fact, if you were a resident of Webb's Winter Resort, you were getting all your meals as part of your lodging. so you didn't have to worry too much about it. But I wanted to share this with you today. And from about 1901 up through about 1910, there actually was a general merchandise store in Osprey. And so this is Vic Saunders' store, and you see it's quite a large little grocery store there in Osprey. And the photograph on the left shows the building there. It's up on brick piers right along the bayfront, and it has a little railway, a little rolling cart that they could use to roll all the way out on the dock that you see on the right-hand side. And you see a little lighter barge out there that they would have used to haul things around. And you see sailboats and a couple little power boats out here as well. That photograph's from about 1910. Vic Saunders was originally from Onico, Florida, and moved to Osprey, as far as I can tell, in 1901. So this really opened things up in terms of the Osprey community down there. And of course, Sarasota by this time was well set with several little grocery stores. By 1910, for instance, you had your choice of grocery stores in Sarasota. All right, so now it's time to get into some of the Osprey favorites, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I did putting it together. But you know, one of the things that's really emblematic about Florida are alligators. You know, oranges, alligators. People just think of Florida, and so these are all just images from postcards that were put out over the years. You always saw these images with alligators with their mouths wide open, like they're going to attack you. I don't think I've ever seen an alligator with its mouth open like this out in nature. And then look at the huge alligator, you know, this fanciful Photoshop back in the 1920s of a huge alligator on a railroad car, just to kind of exaggerate the size. So not only did they exaggerate the terror of the open mouth, but the size. And then I love this alligator that kind of represents a map of how to get down to Florida on the railroad. But it's not uncommon to see an alligator even today, of course, in Florida. And people that are at the cafe at Spanish Point, they're sitting out on the little tables there next to White Cottage, just like these folks, you know, back over 100 years ago. And people will see alligator go by in the bay. I mean, we see dolphins, we see manatees, but we also see alligators on occasion. And that was also the case back in the early days. And there's one particular episode where people were sitting here on the porch of the White Cottage, just kind of looking out and enjoying the beautiful bay views, just like we have today at historic Spanish Point campus, where you're, you know, elevated above the water, you got a nice breeze, and now you see an alligator going up, see an alligator out there. Well, in this case, they saw alligator on the sandbar that's offshore. And if you've ever been at Spanish Point at low tide, there's a sandbar out there that's quite extensive. It's on the other side of the channel that leads to the packing house dock. And so they saw a gator out there, a dead alligator on the sandbar. So they got in a boat and they went out to the sandbar. And I'm going to let Charles Webb tell you the story of what happened next, because this is fascinating. And so in his journal, Charles Webb says, one morning, a huge alligator was seen from the house lying upon a sandbar. A boatload of folks went to the bar. The folks clustered around the big reptile, talking and wondering what had caused his death. Mrs. Case, one of the guests at the resort there, stepped upon the back of the alligator and walked around. She remarked that she would have quite a thrilling tale to tell the folks back home about this. Well, after she stepped off the gator, the party was still there, kind of checking it out and admiring the big beast, when suddenly, like a shot, alligator, which had only been asleep, rushed into the water. Mrs. Case really did have a thrilling story to tell her friends in the North. Could you imagine that? You're walking on the back of this thing, you think it's dead, but it's not. And then as soon as you get off, it slides off into the water. So I think you know what's coming next. We've got a recipe for alligator stew. Now, this is actually one of Fran's recipes that appears in the Cooking Then and Now cookbook. And the first thing that she says out of the gate is alligator meat must be tenderized. Soaking it in buttermilk overnight helps. So you can see the ingredients here. Alligator meat, butter, some onions, some garlic, some flour, some beef stock, some tomatoes, and some salt and pepper. And so, first of all, she reminds you, tenderize the meat, and then saute the onions and the garlics until it's limp. Cut the meat into bite-sized pieces. And I think that helps as well because of its lack of tenderness, naturally. And add to the onion and the garlic mixture. Cook it 10 minutes. Add the flour and cook it another 5 minutes. Then add the beef stock, the salt and the pepper, and cook it all for 25 minutes. Serve over rice and, in Fran's own words, and pass the hot sauce. So here's alligator stew, just one thing that you can do with alligator. And for those of you interested in maybe doing this sort of a recipe, you can buy alligator and try this out yourself. And then here's another one. This is another one of Fran's recipes. So she was into the alligators, gator tail and barbecue sauce. Here again, you see all the ingredients up there, and we're going to add in some mustard to this one, and some catsup and some Worcestershire sauce. Anyway, you want to salt and pepper the gator tail. Cut it like a pork chop, so you're cutting across that tail into little slices. Fry that in your hot grease, and then fry some bacon until crisp. Add the onion, the garlic, and the remaining ingredients. Bring it to a boil and simmer it until it's thick. So then you got your gator tail, you got your sauce to go on it, and you got everything you need to have a great little meal. This little item appears in a book published by a gentleman named G.O. Shields. The book was called Rustling in the Rockies. Quite of the book is about his exploits in hunting and exploring out in the Great West. But he also spent some time in Florida, specifically at Osprey, and specifically came to the Webb's Resort as an outpost to go hunting and fishing. So he says, we arrived at Mr. Webb's house just as night set in, and we were given the most cordial greeting, although we were entire strangers to the family. Such kind and hospitable treatment as we received, and such a clean, wholesome, palatable supper as we were treated to that night, made us glad in our hearts that we had had the good fortune to be directed to and finally reach the home of these kind-hearted people. So this guy had probably come on a ship to the east coast of Florida, across on a railroad over to Cedar Key, down to Manatee, and ultimately hired a gentleman in Sarasota with a sailboat to bring him on down to Osprey. And this is like his first impression of Webb's place in Osprey. So the Webb sons take him out hunting on the Myakka River. They go out for 4 days, and they're going to go hunt some deer and some turkey. So they were very successful on the turkey side. And so this is a great little excerpt. You all have heard of the Turducken. Sarasota's famous for the Turducken, the little Alpine steakhouse down there on 41. They've been on TV because of their Turducken. Well, we discovered in Sarasota's history a turduck. So here's the story. So Shields is saying, as I dressed the turkey, I noticed there was a large cavity in it after removing the entrails, which I thought might be well utilized. So I grabbed a teal duck and put it in there, placed the turkey over the fire without mentioning it to either of the boys. When we sat down to dinner, Jack took hold of the turkey to carve it and saw the leg of the duck protruding. He pulled the little fella out, held it up, and dryly remarked, well, I've traveled this road a year or more, but never saw a gobbler with such a young one before. The young one was well done, however, and we relished it quite as much as any dish on the bill of fare. So I just love these old accounts. And what a great little opportunity that he had. He saw the big cavity in the turkey. He grabbed the duck, he put it in there, and Jack Webb, I guess, just didn't have any idea what he had done. So I thought we'd do a little recipe of how to fry a whole turkey. And so in this case, we've got ingredients, and then we've got ingredients for the seasoning, and then we got some equipment that we need. So on the equipment side, we need a portable gas burner. We need a large cooking pot. We need a basket as a fryer so we can lift the turkey out of it. And we need a large syringe. On the ingredient side, we need a big turkey. We need some peanut oil. We need some Italian dressing, some Dijon mustard, and then some other seasonings that we're going to use. So fill the syringe with the Italian dressing and inject that in the turkey. Cover the turkey with the mustard and the other seasoning. Heat the oil until the temperature reaches 350 degrees. Immerse the turkey into the pot for 30 minutes. And as the turkey turns dark as it cooks, you know it's ready to eat. So that's a whole fried turkey. Got to be careful when you do this. And you don't want to put a cold turkey into hot oil, but this is one great way to cook it up. So we'll shift gears a little bit to oysters because I've kind of held back something that I really wanted to put into the very first program in the series, but I decided to save it for later. And the historic Spanish Point and the Webb's Winter Resort was famous for its oyster pie. So, there are abundance of oysters all over the place. because of the fresh and salt water mingling there in Little Sarasota Bay. So you got an image here, people out gathering up oysters in the bay. And then we've got a picture of John Webb, the proprietor of the resort here with his little dog sitting on the porch of his house there, the old homestead house, which was down just beyond where Bertha Palmer built her sunken garden. And he was famous for his oyster pie that he served to all his guests. And so I've been looking for years for a recipe for oyster pie. I went online and did a little poking around and actually found this recipe from 1673, which is a pretty extensive recipe. And I'll just read portions of it to you here. It's not super easy to read because the letters, the S's look like F's, and you have to figure out if it's an F or an S. But it says take a handful of parsley, thyme, an onion or two, mince them very fine, put to them a little grated bread. Take your cloves and your mace and your nutmeg and salt and pepper, and season your oysters, and then put them in your coffin, which is interesting. This must be a baking dish, and then put them in there with some blanched chestnuts and some potato. Add some yolks of hard eggs, and then you put some sliced lemon, some butter, and then he's describing this as like pouring it all in this pan, and then he says close up your pie. So I'm thinking he's talking about the pastry on top, and bake them in a thin coffin. For a little more than an hour will be sufficient baking for them, and then when you're done, you want to pour on a little of the oyster liqueur, which is kind of the liquid from the oysters that you've saved from the beginning, some white wine, yolk of an egg or two, some more butter, and then cut up the pie and put it in the oven and serve it up. So anyway, this is an ancient 1673 recipe for oyster pie. Well, also online, I found a modern recipe for oyster pie, and this is from www.allrecipes.com. They've got all sorts of great recipes there. And this is a Cajun oyster pie. And so this one kind of adds in some Cajun seasoning and some Worcestershire sauce. And basically, this one is a more modern recipe. So it's saying preheat the oven to 350 degrees. You never see that on an old recipe. Nobody's preheating ovens. The oven in the old days was already hot. You stoked it all the time with wood, and it was always hot. You didn't have to preheat it. But that's why all these new recipes, you have to preheat them, because all the timing is based on how long it's going to spend in the oven at that temperature. Anyway, 350 degrees. Place the bacon in a large deep skillet. Cook it over medium high until it's evenly brown. Drain your bacon, reserving 1 tablespoon of bacon grease that you're going to need later, and crumble the bacon and set it aside. Heat the bacon grease and vegetable oil over medium heat. Stir in the flour and cook the flour until it's light brown. Then slowly whisk in some milk and 1 cup of the reserved oyster liquid. Stir until a thick gravy has formed, and then stir in your Worcestershire sauce and your Cajun seasoning and your oysters, and then pour the mixture into pie shells. You can do it individually and cover the top. Bake it for 30 minutes until the crust is golden brown. So we've got an ancient recipe for oyster pie, and we've got a modern recipe for oyster pie. But I wanted to see is how can we hone in on whatever kind of oyster pie John Webb used to make. And right in front of my eyes, it was in the Women's Club Florida Cookbook from 1914. So this isn't from John Webb, but this is a very simple recipe. Fill a pudding dish with oysters. Sprinkle with salt and pepper and add some bits of butter. Soak 1 cupful of breadcrumbs in milk and 2 well-beaten eggs and add it to the oysters. Cover the dish with a good pie crust, leaving an opening in the center for the steam to come out. Cook it. You're good to go. So this was probably more along the lines of what John Webb was making, just a simple oyster pie that you could imagine would be a very unique treat for people coming from all over the country to come to Florida and Osprey in particular and enjoy some local food. Now, I thought I would combine the last 2 items, turkey and oysters, and I found this little recipe for some oyster stuffing for your turkey. So the directions here to drain the liquor. I love how they say the liquor from about 20 oysters and chop them very fine. And then rub smooth, dry breadcrumbs enough to make a pint. So you're making these breadcrumbs is what they're saying. Season it with salt and pepper and moisten with a little melted butter and some oyster liquid, and then stir in the chopped oysters and stuff the turkey. So they're combining oysters and turkey all in one. This come out of the 1914 cookbook. Well, when we think of historic Spanish Point campus, we got the packing house. They had the orange grove there, growing oranges and lemons, and of course, in addition to the vegetables that they grew. And on the left, we have actually, a reproduction of a packing crate for oranges. And John Webb was selling oranges well before color lithography was available. So they didn't have a fancy citrus product label on the Webb crates. They had a stencil that said John G. Webb, Osprey, Florida. That was the origination. And that was his chop. That was his brand. That was his mark. And on the right-hand side is kind of a fanciful citrus product label that was developed when the packing house was restored to commemorate that. And it shows the packing house just as it is today and was back in the day. It shows the Vision sailboat, which was the sailboat that was built by Frank Guptill and the Webb family so that they could market all their products. And this is kind of a fanciful Vision brand of oranges for Spanish Point. So I think you know where I'm going next. We're going to do some recipes that have to do with oranges. And so this is a little item taken directly from a manuscript called The Anecdotes in the Life of William Webb. William Webb was John Webb's son. And this says, after the Vision was finished, which we know was 1881, and tried out on the sea, Will and Frank were well pleased with the little ship's behavior. A few short trips, and Will decided to try the voyage to Key West. With Frank Guptill as assistant, they made the trip, and from then on, Will Webb made regular bi-weekly trips to Key West, carrying country produce of sweet potatoes, garden crops such as cabbage, turnips, etc., also poultry and eggs, and sometimes hogs. His father, John Webb, also shipped his famous orange marmalade and cane syrup, which brought the highest price. So this was how they were making a lot of their money. And this is why we sell orange marmalade at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens Historic Spanish Point campus, and it's labeled with our packing house brand. It's locally packaged for us by a company right here in Sarasota. And it's part of the tradition of our campus and the lifestyle in the Osprey area that they were utilizing all their resources to earn money. And the orange marmalade was a very popular one. They make a lot more money selling marmalade than just selling the oranges themselves. And then on the left-hand side is actually the copper kettle that was donated by the Webb family to Spanish Point years ago. And they described it as for making crystalline sugar, which John Webb did do, and which was very unusual for people to do in Florida. Typically, they would squeeze the sugar cane and make cane syrup and molasses, but very few people went to the effort to have additional pots where they could boil it down more and boil it down more to create crystalline sugar, which is quite an art form, science and an art. But we also believe this is the vessel that was used to make John Webb's famous orange marmalade. So we have it on display in the Guptill kitchen. It is a beautiful relic of times past. But anyway, if you've never tried this orange marmalade, you can obtain it in the gift shop at the downtown campus, or you can obtain it at the Welcome Center at Historic Spanish Point. And it is really, really good. And we do not have John Webb's recipe, but we have other recipes. And so let's take a look at a couple of those. This one from Mrs. Jessie D. Crosby. She submitted it for inclusion in the Women's Club Florida Cookbook. And she says, slice 10 native oranges, sour oranges, native sour oranges. So let's talk about that. So for your marmalade, you do not need sweet oranges, and you really don't want sweet oranges. You want some sour ones. And there were sour oranges all over the place because sour oranges is typically what you get when a tree is grown from a seed, maybe a seed dropped by a bird or something like that. It's just a wild orange tree, not a cultivated one, but a wild one. Those will go sour. And you also had lemons, so you could have used that too. Having first peeled and removed the seeds, retain the peelings, because that's what you want for the marmalade. Scrape all the white off them and slice with scissors. So then you're going to add to the orange pulp, the actual oranges themselves, cover it with water all night. And in the morning, drain off this water and add fresh water. But what you're trying to do with that is take some of the bitterness out of it because the peel has a lot of bitterness to it. So then you're going to add fresh water, a pint for every orange. So you started with 10 oranges, you got 10 pints. Cook until tender, then add 1 pound of sugar for each orange and cook until proper consistency. Can you imagine that? 1 pound of sugar for each orange. So again, this is making quite a little quantity of orange marmalade, but boy, no wonder it's so sweet. And here's another recipe for orange marmalade. And this one came out of the Cooking Then and Now book that Fran Newton had helped put together. And this recipe was submitted by Viola Goldberg, who I told you about in the last program. She had grown up in Tampa and spent her whole life in Florida, was quite the cook, and shared quite a few recipes. She provided the recipes for the Cuban sandwich that I shared in the last program, and I think one other recipe that we had there too. So here she's got you washing the sour oranges, peeling them thinly, leaving as much of the white rag as possible because that contains the pectin, is what makes the marmalade really gel. And then save the peel from 2 oranges, cover this peel with water, and then you're gonna let it soak a little bit and try to remove again some of those bitter oils. And then quarter the oranges, chop them up fine, chop fine the cooked peel. Sometimes people use scissors to cut the peel. That's another way it's done. And then cover the chopped fruit with water and boil for 10 or 20 minutes. And then with a sieve, kind of dip out half of the pulp and the peel because you don't need all of it. And then measure 3 cups of the remaining liquid and bring it to a boil. Add 3 cups of sugar. So here again is heavy on the sugar. Cook until it reaches 220 degrees. Remove it from the heat. Pour it into clean, sterilized jars and seal it up. So those are a couple of different marmalade recipes, and that takes care of our Osprey favorites. And now we're going to move on to a couple of Sarasota favorites, and then we're going to take a break for some questions. Well, I've read a lot of articles in the Sarasota newspaper. And in fact, when I was very young, say 19, 20 years old, I took it upon myself to read every article in the Sarasota Times newspaper from 1910 up through 1924. And in doing so, I would read all these articles about people having little parties at their home, little luncheons, little get-togethers, and they would talk about little sandwiches and stuff they would make. So these cream cheese sandwiches, I'd seen these referenced before. So I was able to find this recipe in the Women's Club cookbook from 1914. And this recipe was submitted by Mrs. W.A. Great. And I have to tell you that in every case where I could identify the recipe by their actual first name, I did so. But in some of these cases, these women are using the initials of their husbands' names. And where I could not find their first names, I just left it as it is in the cookbook. And where I could find their actual names, I've used those. So you'll see that as we go through. But so I like this one. Cut thin rounds of rye bread. So you're making them like a little round sandwich. Add enough cream to your cream cheese to enable you to whip it to a consistency to spread it really nicely. Adding enough mustard to make a golden color and flavor it nicely. And then you're spreading this cream cheese and cream mixture 1 inch thick on the bread. Now that's a nice little sandwich. Grate over it 1/4 of an inch of cold boiled ham. So you're just using a grater and you're sprinkling the ham on top of the cream cheese. Then you place in a few olives over this and serve it very cold and fresh. So that sounds like a pretty cool little sandwich for a little get together, a little lunch party. Here's another one. And this one I was attracted to because of the last line in the recipe. This recipe was submitted by Dorothy Dent. She was a member of the Women's Club in 1914. And so she says, rub 2 tablespoons of butter finely into 6 tablespoons of flour. Add 3 tablespoons of grated cheese, a little salt and pepper, and grated nutmeg. Mix the yolk of 1 egg with very little cold water. With this, make the whole into a firm paste. So you're just mixing it all together, which will roll out thinly and then cut it into fancy shaped biscuits. Bake lightly until a nice light brown shade is achieved, and the biscuits keep well and may be warmed over in the oven. So this is something that you could prepare a lot of them, and then you could save them. You could eat them as leftovers, and just sounds like a tasty little treat. One of the very common plants that were grown here in Florida were sweet potatoes. So I thought I would include some sweet potato recipes, and in this case, sweet potato croquettes. So mix 2 cupfuls of hot mashed sweet potatoes, 1 tablespoonful each of butter and milk or cream, and the well-beaten yolks of 2 eggs. Season with salt and pepper, cool and shake, and then dip in egg and crumbs or dip in eggs only and fry in deep fat. So those look some nice little fried sweet potatoes. This recipe was submitted by Mrs. Teat, who was also a member of the Women's Club, and her husband was a developer in Sarasota, built the Francis Carlton Apartments, which are down on Palm Avenue between 41 and Coconut. It's a very nice Mediterranean style building down there. So candied sweet potatoes. Boy, I wasn't sure if I should put this one in the sweets and treats or the Sarasota favorites, but I decided to keep the sweet potato recipes together. So here you can see the ingredients up here. You're going to make your candied sweet potatoes, but you need some other stuff to do so. And you're going to peel and cut up the sweet potatoes and put them in a pot with your beef fat. You're going to add cold water, brown sugar, and sliced lemon. You're going to cook over a very low fire for 3 hours. Notice how this recipe says cook over a low fire. And the syrup should be very thick and the potatoes soft and brown. So candied sweet potatoes, that sounds really good. And then sweet potato cobbler, 2 layers of sweet potatoes boiled just enough to slice them easily. Put in a cobbler pan on a layer of pastry, not too short. I think she's referring to the depth of the pan. And then mix and put over potatoes 2 tablespoonfuls of butter, 2 tablespoons of vinegar, 1 cup of sugar, 1 cup of water, 1 teaspoon of allspice. Top it with crust and bake it. And this was submitted by Mrs. Knighton, who was also a member of the Sarasota Women's Club. And then this one was fascinating. This one's out of the Women's Club cookbook, but it didn't have an attribution for who submitted it. But sea grape soup. And so sea grapes, of course, are abundant all over Florida and the coastline in particular. And the biggest challenge with this recipe these days would be gathering up enough sea grapes to make your soup, because you need 4 cups of them. And they don't all ripen at the same time. So you'd have to have access to quite a few sea grapes. Anyway, you place your sea grapes in a medium-sized pan, cover it with water, and simmer it for 4 to 5 minutes. When cool, put the grapes and the liquid in a jelly bag and extract the juice, so you're squeezing it out. Then add the sea grape to the beef broth and simmer for 10 minutes. And then add rum, doesn't say how much, salt and pepper, and serve hot or cold. So you got some sea grape soup. Now, I had never heard of sea grape soup before I saw this recipe, but this just goes to show how people were very resourceful with the types of things that were available locally that they could make delicious food with. And before we leave the Sarasota favorites, I wanted to include this strawberry soup one, because Fran Newton loved strawberries. It was her favorite thing. The very first recipe that we covered in the very first program of this series was strawberries, and we're going to end today with strawberries, but we're not at the end yet. But at any rate, you want to puree your strawberries and reserving 6 whole berries to decorate when you're done. Mix in the orange juice, the sugar, and the Grand Marnier. Whisk in the sour cream, chill it for 2 hours, serve in small glass bowls decorated with the berries that you saved early on. And so strawberry soup, never heard of such a thing, but pretty cool. And then this is the last of the Sarasota favorites. This is the one recipe that I could find that was actually titled Sarasota, and it's Sarasota crab salad. So a couple of cups of crab meat, and some other tomatoes and cauliflower and celery. And this is a recipe by Mrs. G.W. Franklin. And it mixed the ingredients well with a little French dressing and then with mayonnaise. When ready to serve, place on white lettuce leaves and add more mayonnaise, dressing, and garnish with a hard-boiled egg sliced. So basically, a real simple recipe. And because it's called Sarasota crab salad, I have a feeling that this was again, one that was well known to the people here, and that some of these ladies had prepared for some of their luncheons and meetings and things like that. So I think with that, we'll pause and see if Amanda has any questions from our viewers, and we'll answer those questions, and then we'll go on to the final part of the program, which is going to be sweets and treats.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions. Where did the Webbs get ice for their ice box?
Yeah, so starting in 1903, ice was available in Sarasota, manufactured ice. And so they could come to Sarasota and get ice, or they could buy it off of fish boats that were going down Little Sarasota Bay. So ice was readily available after 1903 and almost impossible to obtain before that. Although I should say they had a artificial ice plant in Punta Gorda in the 1880s. So if any of the fish, if you needed ice and you really wanted it bad, you could go south to get ice at that point in time. But once Sarasota had ice in 1903, ice was readily available, and was very much welcomed by the people in this part of Florida, as you can imagine.
Let's see. Where was the Osprey General Store?
Yeah, so the Saunders General Store was just south of the packing house along the bayfront there, and it was within the property that is now our Spanish Point campus. It was just a little bit north of our south boundary, and in fact, back in the 1980s, when I was doing some permit work at Spanish Point for Sarasota County, the old piles could still be visible from the structure from the dock, and so but that's long gone, probably taken out by 1910. Well, probably not 1910 hurricane, 1921 hurricane, 26 hurricane. I think they took that building out. It's been long gone.
Were strawberries a big crop in
Hey,
Sarasota?
it's interesting. You don't hear about strawberries a lot. You hear about celery, you hear about citrus. You don't hear about strawberries. But if you're familiar with Bay Vista and Tuttle Avenue in Sarasota, that was where all the strawberry fields were. And Sarasota produced quite a bit of strawberries back in the early days. And so some of the people that I met when I first got involved in history, they actually remember growing up out there and their homes, like there were strawberries as far as the eye can see. And this one woman, she lived right there on the corner, and she just described it was like strawberry fields forever.
Okay, and then we have one more. What kind of crab would they have used for salad or other dishes?
Yeah, yeah. So, I wondered about that when I was looking at that Sarasota crab salad recipe. And, two predominant crabs here, stone crabs out in the Gulf and blue crabs in the little creeks and in the bay. And so I think both of those crabs were probably used seasonally and also just based on people's taste. Some people love blue crabs, some people love stone crabs. But those are the two predominant crabs that would have been used in a recipe like that and available to virtually anybody in Sarasota that wanted to go out and do some crabbing.
Great. All right. I think that's all we have for this section.
All right, so let's just jump into sweets and treats. Always my favorite part. Again, kind of hearkening back to the oranges, I found this little recipe by Miss Edna Halton, and so this is called orange gems. And you see the rest. You see the ingredients here. You need some butter and some lard. You need some sugar, some eggs, some milk, some flour, and you mix it as in any cake. I love this recipe. Just mix it as you know to mix it, and bake it in small tins and serve it hot with orange sauce. In this particular photograph, they've got little slices of orange on top, which is kind of a cool way to do it. But these are little personal cupcakes, if you will. So I thought that was a cool little treat. And then candied orange peel. This is something that I was fascinated by as a youngster, that you could take the peel of the orange and make it into something so delicious. And so you take the peel of 3 oranges and you cut it into strips, boil it until tender, then drain it. Drop it into a syrup made of 2 cups of sugar and 1 cup of water. Boil it down to a very thick soup. Spread it all out on a platter. So basically, you've taken your little sliced peel and you've been soaking it in this stuff, and now you spread it on a platter. And when cool, roll each piece in powdered sugar, which is kind of how we see it here in the photograph. This one was contributed by Mrs. McDaniel and appeared in the Women's Club cookbook. Here, also in the Women's Club cookbook, in fact, submitted by the president of the Women's Club at the time, Alice Ginther, was candied orange peel, just like the last. Soak the peel overnight in water to cover using 1/2 cupful of salt to 1 quart's water. Drain it and boil 20 minutes. Drain it again. Boil 20 more minutes. Drain it a third time and boil until tender using cold water each time. Again, this draining the water and putting fresh water in was to try to get some of the bitterness out of the peel. And then slice in thin strips. In fact, in this case, they're talking about either with a sharp knife or scissors. As I said, sometimes it's easier to do it with the scissors. And while slicing, make a syrup of 1 pound of sugar and 1 pound of water for every pound of peel. Put in the peel and boil slowly until the syrup is all taken up. Take up the peel and roll in the granulated sugar, separating the pieces as much as possible. So it's interesting that two recipes for the same thing appeared in the cookbook back then. And then this one attracted my attention, mostly because of the person who submitted the recipe. This is Bessie Arnold. And if you ever saw my program called Photographers of the Region, which was another program that we did as a historical briefing on Zoom, and it's probably up on the YouTube channel, Bessie Arnold's husband was a photographer who worked here in Sarasota for a number of years, and she ran the back of the house of the photography studio and a gift shop in downtown Sarasota. And so I just thought I would include this one, lemon sponge pie. And you just need some lemon and some sugar and some eggs and some flour and some sweet milk. So you mix it all together in the stated order. In other words, in the order that is listed on the recipes. Lastly, add the egg whites beaten to a stiff broth, stirring lightly until well mixed, and then bake in an open shell and it forms its own meringue. So that's probably a pretty cool recipe for some lemon sponge pie. And then this one I included for a special friend of mine who asked me about sea grape wine. And so I was able to find this recipe. And you 6 to 8 quarts of clean, ripe sea grapes. Folks, this is going to be your biggest challenge on this one, is finding 6 to 8 quarts of ripe sea grapes. They just don't have as many sea grapes around here as we used to. 16 cups of sugar, yeast, nutrient, wine yeast in the Camden tablet, which is kind of helps you make a better wine. And so you want to place your sea grapes in a large pot, cover with water and bring to a boil, and then let it cool. Then you want to put it in a mesh bag because you're going to squeeze it into a large jug and add 2 cups of boiled water. Then you're going to stir in the 16 cups of sugar. Wow. Add the yeast nutrient, cover and set it aside for 24 hours. Then you're going to add the wine yeast and the Campden tablet, cover it and let it sit for 5 days. Then you're going to strain it into bottles and let it sit for 2 months. So you really have to go out and gather up your sea grapes and do this preparation to have your sea grape wine when you want it, because it takes you a little while to make it. And then we're going to talk about another mixed drink because last time, we talked about the mojito and how the mojito was born in Cuba, and it's the oldest mixed alcoholic beverage known to history. And so we're going to go back and do another one with origins in Cuba, and this is the Cuba Libre. And this originated quite by accident. The Spanish-American War is going on. There's a lot of American troops in Cuba, and Coca-Cola had been imported to Cuba in 1899 during the war, mostly because of all the Americans there. And so, but apparently, as the story is told, and it's been kind of recorded by the Bacardi company, because they claim it was their rum that made the first Cuba Libre, there was a U.S. Army Signal Corps captain who was there in what was called the American Bar. Now, this is interesting because there may not have actually been a place called the American Bar, but there were a lot of people in Cuba that were setting up these bars for the American troops. And so those were called the American Bars. So this might not be capitalized this way in reality. But anyway, in August of 1900, 125 years ago this month, this captain poured Coca-Cola into his Bacardi rum and lime. And then he did a toast for everyone in the bar for free Cuba, Cuba Libre. And that's what started it all. So this is also one of the first examples of 2 companies, separate companies, co-promoting a particular drink. So here's our Cuba Libre. And the ingredients, we need some light rum. And light rum has always been the rum to make a Cuba Libre with. And then we need 4 ounces of cola. We need 2 lime wedges and some ice cubes. So you want to take your highball glass, fill it up with ice, squeeze your lemons in there and drop them in. Pour in your rum and then top it off with the Coke. Gently stir it and enjoy it responsibly. So these are 2 very old drink recipes. Last time mojito, this time Cuba Libre, both rum. Rum, of course, was quite available in Cuba and in Florida for that matter because of the sugarcane fields in Cuba. Rum is made from sugarcane, and this was really the most common form of adult beverage in the area. Well, we're going to wrap up today. The last recipe I'm going to share is one that Marlene O'Neill and I just found it yesterday. And we were going through recipes from Rose Griffith, who's the granddaughter of John Webb. And a lot of them were more modern recipes from the 30s and stuff like that. But we found this little recipe for strawberry preserves. And I thought, this is a recipe straight from Spanish Point. And it's Fran Newton's favorite thing to cook with strawberries. So why don't we wrap up our summer series, our 3rd in the series this year, with a recipe for strawberry preserves. And so we need 2.5 cups of sugar, cup of water, quart of strawberries. We're going to boil the sugar in the water until it's real thick. In fact, that word real was kind of added in afterwards, if you notice over on the actual recipe there on the left. So put the berries in and boil for 15 minutes, take off the stove and let set until cool, and then can and cover with para wax. So this is a great little recipe right from our Spanish Point campus, right from the Webb family. Share with you today, maybe 100 years after this was something that they actually used. And Parawax, by the way, was one of the first paraffin waxes that was developed and commercially sold beginning back in the 1850s. It was used mostly to wax sails of sailing ships, but it also became a big brand where people used to can their various produce from their farm. And so, like I say, we're kind of wrapping up the series with strawberries the way we the way we started the series. And for those of you that have not seen all of them, they are all posted up on the YouTube channel. We've got Delicious History Part 1, Delicious History Part 2, Delicious History Part 3. I have so much enjoyed researching, preparing, and presenting these programs, kind of all inspired by Fran Newton and her love for combining food and history. And I think it makes just a great combination. I've learned some things. I hope you've learned some things. And I think that's going to wrap it up today. And Amanda can open it up and we'll see if we have any other questions.
All right. Yeah, we have a couple more questions. Have you tried any of these recipes, John?
That's a that's a great question. So back in the 1980s, when I was working for the county running the historical archives, Elizabeth McCall, one of our everyday volunteers, her and her husband volunteered every day of the week. She made the candied orange peels with both of those recipes and brought them in, and that was a real delight. And in fact, I can almost remember it like it was yesterday because I had never had anything like that before in my life. And to think that you can make something so sweet out of something so sour, of course, just add sugar, right?
Yeah.
But that was one of them. And then let's see, I think there is another. Oh, sea grape wine. Again, actually, this is back when I was in high school. I was palling around with someone who was friends with the Hart's family. They owned Hart's Landing, the little bait shop out on the causeway. And they had run this bait shop on the causeway since like 1936. And my friend's grandmother, we were over at the house one day and she said, "Did you want to try a little of my sea grape wine?" And she poured us all these little short glasses of sea grape wine, and it was delicious. I haven't had it since, but of course, I wasn't of legal drinking age at the time, but it was just a very small amount. But I am so thankful of her sharing that because I can tell you today that yes, I've had sea grape wine and it was delicious history.
Great. And one final question. You say this is the last one in the series, but will you do more food in the future?
Well, we've had a lot of fun with this, and I'm seeing some comments here on the screen. People are really enjoying it. We have enough recipes. I mean, I've been gathering more and more recipes that I think we might do a future program with some recipes. But it's very interesting to be able to kind of connect the history to the recipes, and it's a way to kind of connect botanical things to history as well.
Did you?
We'll certainly be up for doing some more of this. Sure.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. And like John said, we will have this up on YouTube probably later on this afternoon. And you'll find the other programs there as well. Thanks so much and hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.